but it's also culture and processes underneath that enable it. And by having those three things together, mentality, culture, and processes, Amazon's been able to reinvent itself over and over and over again, from a bookseller to a first-party marketplace that has just about everything online, to a third-party marketplace, which is now propelling the retail business.
Welcome to eCommerce Deep Dive, a podcast featuring the biggest players in retail and e-commerce. Your host is John Giorso, founder and CEO of Orca Pacific. This week, John is joined by Alex Kantrowitz, on-air contributor at CNBC and founder of Big Technology. The two discuss Alex's latest book, Always Day One, which explores the inner workings of Amazon and other tech giants. They discuss Amazon's culture of self-disruption and where Amazon's innovation will lead them next. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome everybody to this episode of eCommerce Deep Dive. On today's show, I have Alex Kantrowitz. Alex is the author of a book that covers a lot of technology platforms, among them Amazon. The book is called Always Day One. Alex, I love the book. Really excited to have you on the show. Maybe just to start off, we could talk a little bit about you and your background and kind of how the book came about.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I am a reporter who started out in sales and marketing. So I spent 3 years, 2 of them working buying digital ads, 1 year selling ad tech. And then it was like right at the moment when digital advertising was becoming a thing. Like when I was working as a marketing manager, we were buying only print. I came in, I was the young dude at the time, and I was like, hey, have you heard of the internet before? They're like, oh, what's that? And I'm like, well, actually, you can reach people in a much more targeted way, and the money that you spend on the ad campaigns is much less than what you're doing for these poorly targeted print ads. Maybe you actually want to, think about investing there. And they said, okay, do it. And so when I got that faith from the managers that I had, and to be able to start allocating money into the digital advertising world, I had to learn. And I started to realize that the stories that were being told in the media didn't match up with the reality on the ground that I was seeing in the industry. And so I started saying, well, I wrote a few stories for my college newspaper. Maybe I can try my hand at writing a few stories about this stuff as well. And those stories, once I wrote them, started to get a little bit of traction. And all I could think about was writing the next story. And I started thinking more about journalism than I thought about my sales job, to the point where I was like, I'm not going to hit my numbers probably any quarter ever again, but the blog posts are coming along pretty well.
Yep.
So can I make this career transition? Long story short, I went to work at Ad Age, which is an advertising trade magazine covering digital advertising, ad tech, and marketing tech. Did that for a couple of years. And I saw all the money going from those platforms to companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and Snapchat. And I was sitting in New York at the time, and I told myself, look, I have a decision to make. I can stay in New York and write obituaries for these ad tech companies, or I can get on a plane, go to the West Coast, and be where the action is. And in 2015, I landed in San Francisco and took a job at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed News at the time, had done some tech culture coverage, but wasn't really known for the tech industry coverage that I think it is known for today, at least in some areas of the tech world. And I really believed in the publication. I believed in the philosophy that they had. Basically, they were never about aggregation. They were always about reporters going out and finding original stories and finding stuff you couldn't get anywhere else. That was appealing to me. So I joined the bureau, covering Facebook and Twitter, Google to some extent, Snapchat. I covered the Snapchat IPO. And I had studied a little bit about company culture in college. I was a labor relations major, and I saw the companies in Silicon Valley doing things totally differently from any other company I had seen before and any I had studied in college. And I thought that there was an opportunity to figure out what was different about the tech giants. What are they doing on the inside that's different from everyone else? And do what I can to write it down and make sure that people across the world, not just within the tech giants, but their competitors, their partners, and the people who want to work for them, get an understanding of what's going on inside these companies, because there's been so much mystery, especially, being in Seattle, no one really knows what's going on. I mean, people in Seattle maybe know more than usual, but In the retail industry and the tech world at large, Amazon's a bit of a mystery. Facebook, we have a kind of idea what's going on inside there. Google, we know. Amazon's a mystery. And so my idea was, why don't I spend a couple of years figuring out what's going on inside these tech giant companies, and then write a book explaining what about their cultures makes them different, and then try to answer the question: is that are those cultural differences the reasons for their success? And I believe strongly that it is. I believe that culture is the most important thing that these companies do differently, and that's what's helped them succeed. And I learned a ton about these companies and the way they operate and the important businesses, uh, you know, inside the companies while doing it, and sort of try to wrap it all up in always day one.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great summary. I really enjoyed the book. I mean, just from a macro perspective, someone that's interested in technology and organizations, specific to what I focus on day to day, the Amazon section or sections, I guess, were some of the best, and I would say from my perspective, kind of most intimate and accurate portrayals of Amazon's culture that I've ever read. So for anybody that's listening, if you're just interested in the Amazon section, that's worth the price of entry in and of itself. But maybe kind of to start at the macro, you mentioned your thesis here is that culture sets these organizations apart, not just the medium, not just kind of the industry that they're in. What is it specific to Amazon culturally that you think has made them so successful?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Amazon culture out there. And I'm going to be mindful because I know I'm speaking to an expert audience here. The people, the aggregate amount of experience that your listeners have is going to be the people who are most up to speed on what's going on inside Amazon out of any podcast that I've spoken on before. So I'm going to do my best. And honestly, if they have feedback, it'll be great to hear it. But look, I think that the misconception around Amazon is that the place just makes people bust their butts. And because of that, it's successful. Everybody works hard at Amazon. We know that because, if you've spoken with Amazon, people who work at Amazon, they walk around with cell phones that are going to call them out of your dinner and out of Thanksgiving and out of whatever movie they're sitting in to go figure out what's going on with some aspect of the site. And we know that because the New York Times wrote this very famous, or some might call it infamous, article talking about how Amazonians cry at their desks.
Sure.
Which was true, but people at every company cry at their desks. But it does seem like a good amount of Amazonians have a really tough time with the culture. And I think that there's this, Jeff Bezos has put this image of himself as a tough guy out there. And I think to most people outside of this one, most close concentric circle to Amazon, think that Amazon's successful because it's ruthless and because they just work so hard. But the secret to Amazon culture, at least what I learned, runs a little bit deeper, which is that most big companies, when they get to a certain size, start to prioritize their legacy businesses. These are the businesses that are their flagship products. They are the ones they're making the most money off of. They're the ones that they have the most invested in and the most at stake at in terms of what their success is or not. And I think what Amazon does really effectively, it says, forget about what happened any moment until now. Let's imagine this was our first day as a company. What would we build? Doesn't matter what was going on beforehand. What's the most important business for us to be in right now? And that's what Jeff Bezos, when he does, he says always day one. It sounds a little bit like hustle porn. It sounds like you can't take your foot off the gas pedal. And when someone asked him what day two looks like, he famously said it's stasis, followed by paralysis, followed by slow, painful decline, followed by death. And I was like, whoa, you better work those weekends. That was my first thought. But no, really, the benefit of being in your first day as a startup is being able to operate as if it is your first day, which means constant reinvention. And that's how you see it's a mentality, but it's also culture and processes underneath that enable it. And by having those three things together, mentality, culture, and processes, Amazon's been able to reinvent itself over and over and over again, from a bookseller to a first-party marketplace that has just about everything online, to a third-party marketplace, which is now propelling the retail business, software, a cloud computing platform, hardware manufacturer with the Kindle and the Echo, and then a grocer, not to mention an Academy Award-winning movie studio. Yeah. And I think it is this culture that's extremely unique, and it has helped Amazon. Amazon's probably the most pure form of this always day one mentality out of all the tech giants. I would say each one of them embody it in their own way. Apple's kind of slowed down. They're definitely in the asset milking phase versus the reinvention phase, and we can get into that. But I think that's really what's helped Amazon succeed. And without that culture, you just wouldn't have the company that you have today.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and I couldn't agree more. And I've been working with Amazon pretty closely for over a decade. When people ask me kind of to explain what is the secret behind Amazon's success, the way I've always phrased it, I think it's a similar way of looking at it. Is that Amazon is hundreds of startups under a single umbrella that are all kind of working to innovate and disrupt, all with kind of a very similar macro mission for the company, but with a lot of autonomy and kind of ability to create disruption within their own organization. Amazon is the only company I've ever seen that as they've gotten bigger, they've gotten more innovative. It just defies the laws of anything we've known about. As companies get bigger, they tend to slow down. The only reason I've ever been able, or the only way I've ever looked at that is, if they used to be 100 startups and then they were 1,000, as they've gotten bigger, now they're 10,000 startups. If you have 10,000 startups iterating in an open market, that market will be more productive. I don't know if does that jive with your experience and kind of the way that you view that when you say structure and process set up to basically create that always day one mentality, is that part of it?
Absolutely. And there's one more key point, which is every company would like to be 1,000 different startups.
Yeah.
But there's something important. It requires giving permission to people to start working on things that might kill your existing business.
Yeah.
And every company says, oh, we're looking towards the future. Very few actually do it. For example, let's talk about another Seattle company or Seattle area company, right? Microsoft.
Yeah.
Microsoft honestly told us that it was the most innovative company in the world. But it was, and it remains so, but it had a rough point. And why did it have that rough point? It's because it had Windows, and that was its key asset. And there were things that threatened Windows, desktop operating system. There are things that a desktop operating system doesn't like if it wants to survive. Doesn't like the internet, because the internet allows computing to happen on any machine, and doesn't like mobile for obvious reasons. And so Microsoft for a long time just delayed on mobile and delayed on cloud. And there were two competing factions inside Microsoft. There were a group that I call the asset milkers, who said, look, our number one goal is to make sure we get the most money out of Windows possible. So we're not going to support any cloud businesses, because that means people can get anything on the internet. They can use a Chromebook or they can use Apple machine. And we have a lock-in with Windows. Let's not support the cloud. That turned out to be an incredibly costly mistake. And they're now number two behind Amazon. We can come back to that. Right. And with mobile, of course, Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone. They never really got their footing in mobile. And for a long time, they didn't even make their products available across devices on mobile, which is why it was such an impactful moment when Satya Nadella stood up in his first presentation and demonstrated Office on, I believe it was the iPad or iPhone, some iOS device. That was his way of showing this is Microsoft becoming a future stater and not, building towards the future state and not milking the asset. I think what's amazing about Amazon is that they have those 10,000 or 1,000 different startups within the company, but not one of them is told you can't work on this because it might hurt our existing business. Just to go back to Microsoft, I hate to spend so much time talking about Microsoft, but it's important to understand Amazon.
Sure.
And Microsoft had a leading web browser, right? So it was there dominating the web with Internet Explorer. And it purposely kind of neglected it because it saw that it was going to be a threat. And took it down to a maintenance mode. And we, of course, know what happened. Google saw the opportunity, built Chrome, and Google's business was basically built completely off of Chrome. More than 60% of searches were going through browser and toolbar versus people typing in google.com. Now, nobody types google.com in. Imagine Microsoft built a fast product that would have disrupted Windows. So inside Amazon, it doesn't exist. You think about it like, One of the best examples, I'm sure this is familiar to folks who are listening, is the first party versus the third party marketplace. They literally brought in competitors that were going to undercut all the work their vendor managers were doing in the first party marketplace. But they said, screw it, because if we don't build this, somebody else's. And we're not in business for the first party marketplace. We're in business for Amazon. And so this constant willingness to change what they're doing and operate without any regard for legacy has really been the key thing for them. And by giving that permission, those 1,000 startups within the company have been able to survive.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that's a great way of summarizing it. And it is one of those things inside of a company. Stasis is kind of the default mode. So you have to work really hard to prevent these sort of legacy silos and kind of that, milking mentality be pervasive, because that's kind of the way I look at it is that's the default mode. That's what every company will end up kind of gravitating towards, unless you're not very, very deliberately like forcing that to kind of, forcing that self-disruption mindset. So one of the parts of the book that I found most interesting, because it impacts like my day-to-day life, our clients' day-to-day life, lots of conversations that have gone on in our industry, is this hands off the wheel concept. I think it's indicative of general kind of Amazon culture, but it's also just fascinating from the perspective of a brand who is, directly impacted by this. I think a lot of the time in our industry, this hands off the wheel concept is seen as just a way to excuse not paying attention or not wanting to call someone back, or, it's the equivalent of saying, well, there's nothing I can do. My manager said, I can't do it. That's not the case. This is a real program. It's a serious initiative. It'd be great just to go into detail on that.
Yeah. Well, you said something pretty profound, which is that stasis is the way that most companies operate. They spend their time preserving the status quo versus moving forward. And so why is that? And I think the answer is because it's the way that we structure work. So I look at work in two different ways. There's two different types of work. The first bucket of work is idea work, anything involved in coming up with a new idea, bringing it to life. And the second bucket is called execution work. If I was probably more accurate, I would have called it support work, right? Anything involved in making sure a current product is sustainable. And we've gone through three different phases in the modern history of work with this stuff. And pardon the quick history lesson, but in the industrial economy, where all stories like this have to start, we were spending all of our time on execution work. So the idea work was done at the outset. Someone would say, I'm going to create a factory and we're going to create widgets, right? That was the idea work. All of the people's time inside that company was then spent on execution work. They were in the factory making widgets. Then we moved to the early part of the knowledge economy and we said, all of a sudden, hey, people's ideas matter. So we start to make room for employee ideas. So we create some room for idea work. But we're still spending in the knowledge economy today almost all of our time on execution work, as opposed to thinking up something new and bringing it to life. We spend our time supporting existing products, and there's plenty of work to go around. I mean, if you think about what it takes to, create one product, there's invoicing, billing, marketing, planning, all this stuff that goes into it.
Sure.
Then you have HR, you have, all the different accounting functions, try to make it all work. And then you do it all over again. And by the time you take a breath, you don't have a time to think of something else because you have your next batch of execution work to go through. And so one of the interesting things that some fairly recent technological advances have allowed us to do, some might call it AI, others might call it machine learning, whatever it is. I mean, it allows you to, these modern advances allow you to take technology and reduce execution work and make room for idea work. And honestly, like at the end of the day, it can be just programs that make you more efficient, right? We all use enterprise software. That's a way to get towards it. And I think the holy grail of this is automation technology, to be able to smartly automate a process. And that brings us to hands off the wheel. So Amazon's retail organization definitely the biggest organization inside Amazon, took a tremendous amount of labor to make it work. And that's because you had all these different fulfillment centers across the globe and needed people to be on the phone with each individual brand saying, all right, Tide, it's May. In June, we're going to need this many units in this many fulfillment centers. And based off of previous orders, I'm going to guess that this is the right amount. Would 85 cents a unit work for you?
Yeah.
And they go back and forth. And you can understand that once you multiply that times, however many units they have inside a fulfillment center, that's basically all of Amazon's bandwidth. It becomes a execution work machine. And so what they did smartly was look at the thing and say, and this started about 10 years ago, is they looked at the thing and they said, look, we have so many years of purchase data at our disposal. Can we use technology to start to make predictions about the amount of items people are going to purchase at what price and what zip codes, and then use that technology to actually end up buying those products from our suppliers? And it wasn't easy. I mean, it took the traditional machine learning algorithms need a lot of data to work. So products that would, have many items sold in a quarter, maybe that would be something machine learning could predict pretty well. But what about something where you sell like one or two or 10 or a couple dozen
Or it's a new
a quarter,
product, right?
or it's new, right?
Yeah.
The technology can't account for that.
Yeah.
So it took a lot of work to figure it out. But eventually, the machine learning team got this stuff under wraps and were able to put it into their vendor manager software. So the vendor managers, again, the people that were dealing with the brands. So instead of like logging stuff in their software and then being done with it, they saw the machine learning predicting what they should be doing. And so they had a choice initially: do you automate or do you actually override and do it manual? And then slowly but surely, Amazon started to give targets. So X% of your actions need to be, hands off the wheel. It's funny. It started off as, sometimes in tech, the code names really tell you everything you need to know. So it started off as Project Yoda. People in the company, some called it Project Yoda. Instead of the vendor managers using it, Amazon would use the Force, right?
Yeah.
This kind of sci-fi thing, something in the future. And once they got it working well, they turned it into hands off the wheel. And literally became what it was.
A bit literal there.
Yeah, take your hands off the wheel. Because this car is driving itself.
Hey there. I'm Dave Zimmerman with Orca Pacific. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to let you know this episode is brought to you by Orca Pacific, a Mighty Hive company. We're a full-service agency exclusively focused on Amazon with capabilities for everything a brand needs to succeed on the platform. From advertising strategy, content development and SEO, to merchandising and marketing. If it relates to driving and converting demand on the platform, our dedicated teams are leaders in this space. Our robust suite of services includes expertise on the back end as well, from operational support, demand forecasting and planning, to the right fulfillment options, and higher level strategies like long-term planning, channel management, and access to beta programs. To learn more, visit our website at www.orcapac.com. That's ORCAPAC.com. And a business development manager will get you up to speed on how we can accelerate your Amazon business. Now, back to the show.
So I've been in this industry, I guess, 13 years at this point. I specifically remember somewhat of a sea change when they first started rolling this out. A lot of vendor managers left because they were not having fun doing what they were doing because their jobs had changed quite a bit. The way you had to communicate with Amazon all of a sudden changed in a pretty substantial way as a brand or agency representing a brand. But it's been this kind of otherwise long trudge in terms of like rolling this out. I mean, today there's still vendor managers, there's still in-stock managers. Now there's less of them than there were before, especially as Amazon's grown proportionally. But do you have a crystal ball on this? Like, because my sort of understanding has always been that the eventual goal is it's just like a supercomputer runs the entire retail org, and you have some management at the top and make sure the computer's, doing the right things. But otherwise, it's almost entirely automated. Is that a goal, or am I overstating that?
I think so. Well, first of all, let me answer the question, then I'll tell my stories.
Sure.
I think that it is part of the goal. I don't think it's a fully automated future,
Yeah.
but I think largely automated, yes. From the brand side, you were mentioning the brand side, it just struck a light bulb in my head. It's like people went from having vendor managers pick up the phone
Yep.
to now negotiating with like a computer portal.
Yep. Literally. Yeah.
And all your listeners know this, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's you're now negotiating with Amazon's AI, right?
Yeah.
Which is pretty freaking wild.
Yeah.
And look, so here's what I think the future is, at least my understanding from what Amazon wants. Um, the vendor managers go from people doing mundane, repeatable duties to people who have some artistic element to their job,
Sure.
right? So instead of sitting there and typing in numbers on a spreadsheet, you're going to fashion shows and trying to pick out
Yeah.
what might be the next trend, and then trying to make sure that's represented on the Amazon site. Another example they gave is fads, right? So some of the items that sell pretty wildly on the internet are these, things that pop up out of nowhere, and then
Yeah.
everyone needs to have them, like a
I
fidget
think,
spinner.
did you mention fidget spinners? Was
That's
that the
right.
example
Yeah.
in the book? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, Amazon's CEO of Worldwide Consumer, at least at the time, Jeff Wilke, was like fidget spinners. He's
Yeah.
like, we know they exist now. They didn't exist before. I
Sure.
don't know if they're going to exist next year. So you need people to anticipate that stuff. It seems to be more enjoyable if you wait it out and remain in the retail organization trying to do stuff like that. Seems more enjoyable than just ordering detergent.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but like I
That's,
can see why people were frustrated.
yeah. 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 And that's very, very hard to do
Totally.
with an AI. I mean, maybe in some science fiction future, all of the inputs it scrubs, the AI watches television and it reads blogs and it predicts the next trend, maybe someday, but like, that's not anytime soon. Right. So that's an important kind of human element. Also improving processes. I mean, just generally kind of, here's the machine is largely automated, but we can still make the machine better, faster, more efficient, et cetera. I mean, that's kind of a shifting emphasis on the role as well.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, Amazon is very explicit that when they talk about invention, inside, so their leadership principle, people I'm sure are familiar with the leadership principles, but a quick refresher, if anyone hasn't heard of them, they're like the 13 commandments of Amazon, and people follow them more closely than their own religions. Largely inside the company, they rate their kids based off of the leadership principles. When they're off the clock, they talk in leadership principles. Basically, these are, most companies have a mission and a vision, and, it's buried somewhere on a website. It doesn't really make any sense. No one lives it, but Amazon does live these leadership principles. And one of them is invent and simplify. So invention is core to the job, not periphery. And simplify is an interesting part of that too, right? It could mean you take the machine learning and you simplify the job, you try to work yourself out of a job, but it's also, I mean, they really look at improving process as invention too. And that exists anywhere from the corporate office to the fulfillment centers. And in fact, when I visited the fulfillment center, I visited two of them, there's a kiosk there for continuous improvement where line workers on the fulfillment centers are able to log their ideas for improving processes to make the fulfillment centers more efficient. And Amazon really listens to those ideas and puts them into play. In fact, like the bins into which that they would pick things out of, whereas like the color was blending in with the packages, which is something that like someone in the corporate office would never know about or care about. And someone logged it or brought it to management, and they made them yellow.
Yeah.
And now the fulfillment center is more effective because of it. So there's invention everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that story from the book. I also think I remember at some point noticing that change, and it's fascinating because I think so many companies would love to be able to do things like that. I mean, it's not that they don't want that type of thing to happen. It's really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to do in an almost 1 million person organization to have someone at the line level come up with an idea to tweak, a process and then actually literally roll that out through the entire organization. Does this come from the top ultimately? I mean, is it because of the one guy in charge?
Well, look, it's because you have to be open to it, right? This is the thing about so another one of the leadership principles, think big. They don't want people, you need to give people permission to think big and to invent and to speak up. And here's what happens inside most companies. Most companies, people come in almost always. They do the interview, they feel excited, it's a good fit, and they come in with all these ideas about how to improve the company. And almost all the time, those ideas are spot on, or a number of ideas are spot on. You should always listen to the employees in the first 6 months because they're going to see things that people who have been working there for a long time will not, because they become blind to it. Most companies, after 6 months, the employees bring the ideas up. They're sent signals that those ideas aren't welcome, that management has this all under control.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, that's nice, but you're really here to do the role we told you to. That, oh, we said
Yeah.
we were going to be open to suggestions, but not that suggestion.
Yeah, but really you need to just keep
Yeah.
using the widgets on the assembly line because
Totally.
we're good. Yeah.
They pound any sense of innovation from the rank and file out of people.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about the need to reinvent, right? So the average company on the Fortune 500 a century ago lasted there for 70 years. So you could live your entire lifetime off of one idea on the Fortune 500. Today it's 15 years. So if you're going to live the same amount of time as a company, as one of your predecessors, you need to reinvent yourself like 5 times.
Yeah.
And that is never going to come from a single leader. This is sort of a misconception, one that I had when I came to San Francisco, of the visionary leader. We thought, oh, there's one person that has all the ideas. It's impossible. It's totally impossible.
Sure.
What companies need to do, successful companies do, is they set themselves up where they realize there's going to be ingenuity that's going to come from everywhere. And when I was sitting with Wilkie, that's what he told me. He's like, look, we want invention from HR, from finance, from people working in the retail organization, from the fulfillment center workers. And if you believe that, and if you set up the systems for them to share their ideas, and and you use the technology to minimize the execution work and make room for it, that's when you all of a sudden start to look like Amazon. Or instead of being on the Fortune 500 for 15 years and finding your way towards your decline, you end up growing and looking more dominant than you ever were. This is totally reversing the arc of history when it comes to big companies. And I believe that this culture is the reason for it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think this is a paraphrase, but I think someone recently asked Bezos, or maybe a few years ago, kind of like, what was his job? Like, what was his actual job? At point, he has the whole S team. He has however many 14 people that could be Fortune 500 CEOs on their own, running the company. And I think what he basically said is his job is to continue to make sure that the culture of the company stays as kind of ever present and strong as it has been into the future. And that culture, that is where the innovation and some of these other principles ultimately come from.
No
so
doubt.
He's not going to come up with all the ideas, but he can make sure the structure is there where those ideas continue to flourish.
Absolutely. And that's the biggest misconception about Bezos out there, is that he's viewed as, and it's probably his fault in some ways, but he's viewed as this Lex Luthor supervillain who does all the things that Amazon does. But essentially what he's done is built a culture, set expectations. He gets involved when he needs to. I think the 6-pager system is extremely smart.
Yeah.
But it is enabling people underneath him to invent. That's really made Amazon special. And I'd love to tell one quick story that will bring this all home.
Please.
So in the hands off the wheel example, so we talked about, so why did Amazon need to use machine learning to reduce all the tasks that people in the retail organization were going to be doing? And, there's this, another misconception is that using technology and automation is all about making yourself more efficient. And again, the way that I think about it and what I've learned from studying these companies is, okay, efficiency is one thing, but it's really what you do with this time that you make for people to come up with new ideas and bring them to life. So in the retail organization, there's this guy, Dilip Kumar, who was working on pricing and promotions. And in the middle of last decade, he goes from pricing and promotions to becoming Bezos's technical assistant, which is where you follow Bezos through every meeting, shadow him, you learn from him, learn the way that Amazon works from a broader level. And then oftentimes you go off and do something interesting on your own. So Andy Jassy was the first person to hold that position. And then he went off and made AWS. So it's sort of like the model that they like to follow. So Dilip finishes up and he looks at the retail organization, and it's all on its way to automation. what are you going to do? You can go back to pricing and promotions.
Yeah.
It's just not going to be a good place for you,
Sure.
especially if you want to do something big. So what he does is he gets together with a group of people from the retail organization and says, how do we fix the most annoying part of shopping in real life with technology? So first they have to decide what the most annoying part of shopping in real life is. That's pretty simple. It's checkout. People like to browse the shelves. They like the idea of going to the store, and they hate having to wait online forever to check out. Once they're ready to get home, they're ready to just get out of there after a certain point. So they say, okay, let's figure this one out. So they come up with this idea for a big vending machine, essentially, punch your items in, spits it out. But they felt that was kicking the can down the curb a little bit too much. So what they do is they say, okay, they develop and refine, and they come up with this idea for a grocery store where you scan in and the machine learning and sensors will basically see everything that you take off the shelves, and you don't need to wait online to get out. In fact, you don't need to scan any items. You take your stuff and you go. And that was the foundation of Amazon Go. And that, I think, is going to be a backbone of Amazon's brick and mortar retail strategy for the next 2 decades, especially when, you see the way that Jeff Bezos talks about Amazon Go, and it's like he's talking about another child. He's so in love with it.
Yeah.
And so this is really where the rubber meets the road on this stuff. It's not necessarily, being more efficient is good. Being, stripping out some of the waste when you order is good. But it's this idea of taking technology, minimizing execution work, maximizing the room for idea work, putting some of the people that were previously doing tasks that were related to stasis, as you mentioned, and putting them towards invention and giving them the permission to do it. And then the company reinvents itself over and over and over again. And that, I believe, is the secret inside Amazon.
Yeah, I love that. And I remember that from the book. I think innovation to drive more efficiency, you can only save so much money, right? Like there is a finite amount of money or efficiency you can get out of any organization. Growing business units, growing revenue, growing, expanding is virtually limitless. Maybe Alex, if you have time for one more question, I don't know if you'll have insight into this. I always like to get the crystal ball out, because Amazon is just such a dynamic company. Is there anything that you think Amazon is going to get into that is not kind of already the consensus? Like, is there anything that you go, I bet Amazon is here in 5 years or in 10 years, and that's going to surprise people?
I could see them acquiring a media company.
Interesting.
I worked at BuzzFeed previously, and I know that a lot of the articles that we were writing were basically just sending visitors to Amazon, and BuzzFeed was getting commission.
Yeah.
And I think everybody in tech thinks that they can do a better job at media than the media.
Yeah.
Of course, then they get into it and realize it's kind of difficult.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think Amazon and all the big technology companies are going to make serious runs at owning their own publications. Amazon already, started the movie studio.
Yeah.
It and knows that leads to retail sales, and it had started its own little social media network, which went nowhere.
Yeah.
So that leads me to believe Amazon has a real interest in media. And I think there's a chance that they either start or acquire a publication and try to, get those product reviews to take the place of all these people that they're paying to do it otherwise.
Huh. Interesting. I haven't heard that one before. So I love it.
We know Jeff Bezos likes it. He owns one already.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bezos. That was like the equivalent of me buying lunch when he went.
That's right.
At the Post. Yeah. So, hey, Alex, this has been great. I know, let's maybe plug the book one more time. And then I know you have a podcast, and anything else you want to get out there, ways for people to get in touch with you, follow you, et cetera.
Yeah. So the book is always day one. You can find it at your bookseller of choice. It's on Amazon. They haven't removed it. So apparently it wasn't tough enough.
Well, they didn't remove, what was it? Was it the Everything Store?
Everything Store.
Yeah.
After Mackenzie wrote a lengthy one-star review for Brad Stone.
I remember that. Yeah.
So if you're interested, the book is always day one. And then the podcast is called Big Technology Podcast. And every week on Wednesday, I release a new episode with an inside tech insider or outside agitator. And we just kind of talk about what's going on in the tech world. It's basically like just an example of the type of interviews I do all the time, but we just put them on tape and release them to the public. So
Yeah.
if you're interested, please give us a subscribe.
Awesome. Alex, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Always fun to talk Amazon.